In August 1997, Jessica Lynn Harmon disappeared from her flower shop in Boulder, Colorado, driving her burgundy SUV home after a hectic summer wedding season. 25 minutes later, she vanished without a trace. Search parties, bloodhounds, and police helicopters combed the mountain roads along Highway 36. All they recovered was her turquoise bracelet and leather purse 4 miles from her home. 8 months passed with no other evidence. Then, in spring of 2019, when crews began draining Marshall Lake for renovations, they discovered something shocking at the muddy bottom: a rusted SUV containing human remains, a faded red wool scarf still wrapped around them, and unidentified male DNA that had silently waited 22 years to tell its story. Someone had been with Jessica that night. Someone had calculated to hide the evidence beneath 30 feet of mountain water for over 2 decades. Someone who never expected science to eventually unravel their carefully concealed crime. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Boulder, Colorado in the late 1990s was an idyllic mountain town nestled against the stunning backdrop of the Flatirons. University students mingled with outdoorsy locals, artists, and tech professionals in this progressive community where crime was something that happened elsewhere. Coffee shops buzzed with conversation, hiking trails teemed with enthusiasts, and residents prided themselves on their tight-knit community spirit where neighbors looked out for each other. In the heart of this picturesque setting, Jessica Lynn Harmon, 32, was a woman many admired. During regular business hours, she worked as a graphic designer at a small environmental nonprofit, channeling her creative talents into conservation campaigns and educational materials. But her true passion bloomed after hours at Wild Roots, her small flower shop specializing in sustainable, locally grown arrangements for weddings and special events. Customers adored Jessica not just for her stunning floral designs, but for her infectious enthusiasm and the genuine warmth she radiated. She possessed an uncanny ability to translate a person's vision into the perfect arrangement, as if she could read the colors of their soul and reflect them back in petals and stems. Beyond her professional pursuits, Jessica lived a rich, purposeful life. An avid rock climber, she could often be spotted scaling routes at Boulder Canyon or El Dorado Springs with a determined smile. She volunteered teaching gardening to elementary school children, helping them grow vegetables and flowers in community plots. Her love of Colorado's native plants had Jessica frequently hiking with a sketchbook, carefully documenting wildflowers and delicate watercolor illustrations she hoped to compile into a field guide someday. Friends described her as fiercely independent, environmentally conscious, and brimming with creative energy. She lived alone in a charming cottage-style home on the outskirts of Boulder, surrounded by a garden that served as both her sanctuary and experimental canvas for new plant varieties. On August 12, 1997, Jessica worked late at Wild Roots preparing elaborate arrangements for a weekend wedding. Sprigs of lavender and mountain wildflowers dusted her apron as she finally locked up around 10:30 p.m. and climbed into her burgundy Jeep Cherokee. At approximately 10:45 p.m., Jessica called her brother from her car phone. She sounded upbeat despite the long day, mentioning she was looking forward to hiking together that coming weekend. It was a brief, ordinary conversation that ended with casual "see you Saturdays" and "love yous." No one could have known these would be the final words her family would hear from Jessica. When Jessica failed to show up at the nonprofit office the next morning, her coworkers initially assumed she was running late due to wedding prep exhaustion. By noon, with multiple unanswered calls to both her home and cell phones, concern began mounting. This behavior was completely out of character for Jessica, who was meticulously reliable and always communicated any changes to her schedule. Her brother, who lived in nearby Louisville, drove to her house after work when he couldn't reach her all day. Jessica's home was undisturbed, her bed made, coffee cup washed in the sink, no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Only the absence of her purse and car keys suggested she'd made it home the previous night. Most telling was the back porch light, still illuminated in broad daylight. Jessica was religious about conserving energy and never left lights on during the day. By evening, her brother filed an official missing persons report with the Boulder Police Department. This wasn't a case of an adult taking spontaneous time away. Jessica's reliability and close family connections made her sudden disappearance immediately suspicious. The first officers arrived at Jessica's cottage within an hour of the report. They performed a thorough walkthrough, noting the home's orderly state. Nothing appeared stolen or disturbed. Her laptop sat on the desk, jewelry remained in the bedroom, and her beloved mountain bike stood in the garage. If she had left voluntarily, she would have taken essentials. In the garden, however, investigators made their first unsettling discovery. A partial footprint in the soft soil of a flower bed below the kitchen window showed a large boot tread, distinctly different from Jessica's smaller hiking boots. Near the garden gate, 3 cigarette butts lay in the gravel, significant because Jessica was a vocal anti-smoking advocate who never allowed smoking on her property. Inside, more subtle irregularities emerged. The landline phone cord had been cleanly severed, explaining why calls to the house had gone unanswered. On the living room couch, a dark blue bandana lay folded, an item her family confirmed Jessica would never own or use. Under ultraviolet light, the forensics team detected traces of fingerprints on the back door frame and smudges on the kitchen windowsill where the screen had been removed and leaned against the exterior wall. Each of these small anomalies, the boot print, cigarette butts, cut phone line, foreign bandana, and disturbed window screen, began forming a disturbing pattern. Someone had been watching Jessica, had entered her home, and had potentially confronted her there rather than on the road as initially suspected. The forensics team meticulously documented and collected every potential piece of evidence. They photographed the boot print and made a plaster cast before it could be damaged. The cigarette butts were carefully bagged for potential DNA analysis. The bandana was sealed in plastic for fiber and DNA testing. Fingerprint powder revealed several partial prints on the back door handle and window frame that didn't match Jessica's. As darkness fell, floodlights illuminated the property while investigators continued their methodical search. Neighbors gathered across the street, huddling together and watching in shocked disbelief as their peaceful community confronted the reality that one of their own had likely been targeted by someone dangerous. By midnight, Jessica Lynn Harmon's disappearance had been upgraded from a missing person case to a suspected abduction. Her burgundy Jeep Cherokee was entered into the National Database for Stolen Vehicles, and her description circulated to law enforcement agencies statewide. The peaceful Boulder community, still healing from other high-profile cases, now faced another troubling mystery. The investigation into Jessica's disappearance accelerated rapidly the following morning. Detectives established a timeline of her final known movements on August 12, 1997. Security footage from a gas station 2 blocks from Wild Roots captured Jessica's burgundy Jeep passing by at approximately 10:40 p.m., confirming she had at least begun her journey home. The grainy footage showed her vehicle alone, with no obvious signs of being followed. The route from Jessica's flower shop to her cottage covered approximately 12 miles, winding through Boulder's outskirts and up into the foothills where newer developments merged with more isolated properties. She typically drove this route with practiced familiarity, rarely deviating even when tired. A couple returning late from a concert in Denver reported seeing a burgundy SUV pulled over on a particularly remote stretch of road around 11:15 p.m., hazard lights blinking. In the darkness and from a distance, they couldn't confirm if it was Jessica's vehicle or see any persons, but the location aligned perfectly with her usual route home. The husband recalled distinctly because they briefly discussed stopping to help but decided it was too dark and isolated to safely do so, a decision that would haunt them in the following weeks. Investigators immediately flagged this stretch of road for intensive searching. This seemingly minor witness statement suddenly carried tremendous weight, potentially marking the last known location of Jessica and her vehicle before they vanished. The Boulder County Sheriff's Department coordinated with State Patrol to compile a list of every burgundy SUV registered within a 50-mile radius. The list quickly expanded to over 300 vehicles. Detectives began the painstaking process of contacting owners, checking alibis, and looking for connections to Jessica or the area where she lived. Simultaneously, detectives delved into Jessica's personal life, searching for anyone who might have had conflict with her or shown unusual interest. Interviews with coworkers at both the nonprofit and flower shop painted a consistent picture of a well-liked, drama-free professional with no known enemies or stalkers. However, one fellow florist mentioned a customer who had visited repeatedly in the weeks before Jessica's disappearance, a man who bought single stems while asking unusually personal questions about the owner. The description was frustratingly vague: mid-30s, medium build, dark hair, but detectives added it to their growing case board. They also investigated 3 men from Jessica's past: an ex-boyfriend from college who had recently moved back to Boulder, a contractor who had done work on her cottage the previous spring, and a rejected suitor from her climbing club who had reportedly made uncomfortable advances. Each man was interviewed extensively. The ex-boyfriend provided a solid alibi, having been at an overnight work retreat when Jessica vanished. The contractor's whereabouts were confirmed by his wife and children. Only the climbing club acquaintance, Thomas Weller, raised mild suspicion with his nervous demeanor and inconsistent account of his activities on August 12. Though he claimed to be at a bar with friends until midnight, the establishment staff couldn't conclusively confirm his presence past 10 p.m. While these interviews progressed, canvassing teams worked the neighborhoods along Jessica's route home. Several residents recalled hearing unusual sounds that night: a vehicle accelerating rapidly around 11:30 p.m., a brief horn blast, even what one homeowner described as a muffled shout. Individually, these might have been dismissed as typical night noises, but collectively, they sketched the outlines of a possible roadside confrontation. In Jessica's neighborhood, an elderly insomniac who often sat on his porch late into the evening reported seeing headlights approach Jessica's cottage around midnight, but oddly, he never heard a garage door open or car door slam. The lights simply went dark after briefly illuminating the front of the property. When pressed for details about the vehicle, he couldn't be certain it was Jessica's Jeep, just that it was a larger vehicle, possibly an SUV. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. With eyewitness accounts suggesting something had happened on Jessica's route home, investigators launched a comprehensive search operation. On August 16, 4 days after Jessica's disappearance, over 150 volunteers from the community joined law enforcement in combing the rugged terrain along Highway 36 and the surrounding foothills. Search teams formed human chains across fields, peered into ravines, and checked abandoned structures. Specialized K-9 units trained for both tracking and cadaver detection worked alongside their handlers, while 2 police helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras scanned from above. The massive search operation continued for 3 grueling days. Volunteers trudged through underbrush, scaled rocky outcroppings, and waded through streams, driven by collective determination to find their missing neighbor. Local businesses donated food and water to support the teams, while Jessica's photos were plastered on every storefront, telephone pole, and bulletin board across Boulder County. On the second day of searching, a breakthrough finally came. A group of university student volunteers exploring a steep embankment approximately 4 miles from Jessica's home spotted something glinting among the scrub oak. It was a distinctive turquoise and silver bracelet Jessica's brother immediately identified as hers, a piece she had purchased at a Native American art fair and wore almost daily. Nearby, partially concealed under fallen branches, they recovered her leather purse, containing her wallet with ID, credit cards, and $43 in cash. The discovery electrified the investigation. Crime scene technicians carefully documented and collected the items, noting the purse showed no signs of having been searched or disturbed. The position of both items suggested they had been tossed rather than dropped during a struggle. Most significantly, the location was nearly half a mile from the main road, far too distant for the items to have landed there accidentally. With this discovery, the search intensified around the area. Cadaver dogs alerted several times near a seasonal creek bed, but extensive digging yielded nothing conclusive. Teams meticulously grid the terrain for half a mile in every direction, searching for additional evidence, clothing, or disturbed ground. Despite these exhaustive efforts, no further traces of Jessica were found. The recovered bracelet and purse confirmed investigators' worst fears: Jessica had not simply run away or suffered an accident. The deliberate disposal of her personal items in such a remote location strongly suggested foul play. Yet the absence of a body, weapon, or clear evidence of violence left detectives in the frustrating position of knowing a crime had occurred without being able to determine exactly what had happened or who was responsible. As the large-scale search wound down, law enforcement continued investigating the three men from Jessica's past. Thomas Weller, the climbing club acquaintance with the shaky alibi, agreed to a polygraph examination. The results were inconclusive, not definitively indicating deception, but showing elevated stress responses to key questions. However, without physical evidence connecting him to Jessica or the scene, investigators couldn't justify further action against him. In the lab, forensic technicians worked to extract usable evidence from the collected items. The cigarette butts found in Jessica's garden yielded partial DNA profiles, but in 1997, DNA technology was still developing, and the samples were too degraded for complete analysis. The blue bandana contained several human hairs that didn't match Jessica's, potentially belonging to the intruder. The boot print was identified as coming from a common brand of hiking boot, size 11, sold widely throughout the outdoor-loving community. By September 1997, the investigation began to lose momentum. Despite hundreds of leads, thousands of man-hours, and the community's unwavering support, Jessica Lynn Harmon and her burgundy Jeep Cherokee remained missing. The media coverage, initially intense, gradually waned as newer stories demanded attention. For the Boulder community, Jessica's disappearance left a wound that refused to heal. Residents who once felt secure in their mountain paradise now locked doors, installed security systems, and eyed strangers with newfound suspicion. The flower shop, Wild Roots, closed permanently after a brief period under temporary management. Jessica's cottage remained empty, a silent memorial that few prospective renters had the heart to occupy. Jessica's family refused to let her case fade into obscurity. Her brother established a small foundation in her name, offering scholarships to botany students and maintaining a website dedicated to keeping her case alive in public consciousness. Every August 12th, they organized a memorial hike along Jessica's favorite trail, carrying native wildflowers to scatter at the summit in her memory. As months stretched into years, Jessica's case gradually transitioned to the cold case unit of the Boulder County Sheriff's Department. The evidence collected, the bracelet, purse, bandana, cigarette butts, and cast of the boot print, was carefully preserved, labeled, and stored. Investigators held on to hope that advancing technology might someday extract more information from these items than was possible in 1997. The case file, once actively passed between detectives at shift change, now sat in the cold case archives, occasionally reviewed by new eyes but yielding no fresh insights. The Boulder community learned to live with an unsolved mystery in their midst, though Jessica's face continued to watch from faded missing person posters in local businesses that refused to take them down. By 2005, 8 years after Jessica's disappearance, even the most dedicated investigators had to acknowledge they were at an impasse. Without new evidence or witnesses, the case had nowhere to go. The primary suspects had all been cleared or lacked sufficient evidence for prosecution. The DNA samples remained unmatched in any database. Jessica and her vehicle seemed to have vanished completely from the face of the earth, until the spring of 2019, when a routine reservoir maintenance project would unexpectedly break the case wide open and shock everyone who thought this mystery would remain forever unsolved. In March 2019, 22 years after Jessica Harmon's disappearance, the Boulder County Water Conservation District announced plans to drain and renovate Marshall Lake, a medium-sized reservoir nestled in the foothills outside Boulder. The project aimed to reinforce the aging dam structure and remove accumulated silt. For most locals, this was simply another infrastructure improvement. For Detective Elaine Martinez, however, something about the location triggered a connection. Martinez had joined the Boulder County Sheriff's Department in 2010, long after Jessica's disappearance. But during her first year, she'd been assigned to review cold cases, including Jessica's. Martinez had meticulously studied the file, memorizing the details of the route Jessica would have taken home that August night in 1997. Marshall Lake sat just 1 5 miles from where Jessica's bracelet and purse had been discovered years before. On a hunch, Martinez contacted the Water Conservation District and arranged to have law enforcement present during the drainage operation. Her superiors approved the request, though most viewed it as a long shot. After all, numerous lakes and reservoirs in Boulder County had been dredged or maintained over the decades without yielding evidence in Jessica's case. The draining process began in early April. As water levels dropped, teams of officers and waders methodically searched the newly exposed shoreline, while engineers monitored the receding water for any unusual objects. Days passed with nothing significant found, and some officers began quietly questioning the allocation of resources to what seemed like another dead end. Then, on April 17, with the lake reduced to approximately 30% of its normal volume, a maintenance worker spotted something metallic gleaming in the murky shallows near the reservoir's deepest section. Initial speculation suggested it was merely abandoned fishing equipment or construction debris. But as more water receded, the unmistakable outline of a vehicle roof emerged from the mud. Martinez was called to the scene immediately. By the time she arrived, enough water had been pumped away to confirm they had indeed found a submerged vehicle. Though caked with years of silt and algae, the distinct shape of an SUV was unmistakable. Martinez's heart raced as she radioed for the dive team and forensics unit. "We need to secure this area now," she ordered, establishing a perimeter around the exposed portion of lake bed. "No one approaches the vehicle until the team arrives." The specialized recovery operation took hours to prepare. Divers entered the murky water to attach cables to the vehicle's frame, while heavy equipment operators positioned a crane on the reinforced dam access road. Local news crews, alerted by scanner traffic, gathered at the perimeter, their cameras trained on the painstaking process. At 4:37 p.m., the crane operator began the slow, careful extraction. As the vehicle gradually emerged from its watery tomb, gasps spread through the assembled crowd. Despite years of submersion, there was no mistaking the burgundy paint of Jessica Harmon's Jeep Cherokee, now faded and eaten away by corrosion but still identifiable by shape and color. Water cascaded from the windows and wheel wells as the vehicle was fully lifted above the waterline. The hood had partially collapsed, the windows were shattered, and thick mud coated every surface, but the license plate, though nearly illegible, remained attached to the rear bumper. After a preliminary cleaning, officers confirmed what Detective Martinez had already suspected: they had found Jessica Lynn Harmon's vehicle. The SUV was carefully transported to a secure evidence facility where forensic technicians could process it in controlled conditions. The media eruption was immediate and overwhelming. Local stations interrupted regular programming with breaking news alerts, while national outlets picked up the story within hours. Boulder residents who had lived through the original disappearance felt old wounds reopening, while younger community members were introduced to a tragedy many had never known about. Jessica's family received the news with complex emotions. Her brother, now married with children of his own, described the moment as like having the wind knocked out of me, relief and devastation all at once. Their decades-long limbo of uncertainty was ending, but the finality that approached would bring its own form of grief. At the forensics lab, technicians worked around the clock to process the vehicle. The initial exterior examination revealed no obvious signs of collision or damage beyond what would be expected from years underwater. Inside, however, the evidence told a darker story. In the back cargo area, partially preserved by the cold mountain water and the vehicle's relatively intact structure, lay human remains. Though largely skeletonized, the bones were accompanied by scraps of clothing consistent with what Jessica had been wearing when she disappeared: khaki hiking pants and a blue button-down shirt. Most tellingly, wrapped around what remained of the upper body was a faded red wool scarf, remarkably preserved in the oxygen-poor environment of the lake bottom. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment indicated the remains were consistent with Jessica's height, build, and age. Dental records would later confirm what everyone already suspected: Jessica Harmon had been found at last. The positioning of the remains in the cargo area rather than the driver's seat was the first concrete evidence that her death had not been accidental. Jessica had not simply driven into the lake, someone had placed her there. Further examination of the vehicle's interior yielded more critical evidence. The ignition showed signs of tampering, suggesting the killer had hot-wired the vehicle rather than using keys. Mud samples taken from the floor mats differed from the lake bottom sediment, indicating the vehicle had been driven off-road before entering the water. Most significantly, fibers caught in the shattered driver's side window matched the blue bandana found in Jessica's home 22 years earlier. But the most crucial discovery came from the faded red wool scarf. Despite years underwater, portions of the fabric had remained relatively protected from degradation. Forensic technicians identified several areas with potential DNA preservation and extracted multiple samples for testing. Using techniques that didn't exist when Jessica disappeared, lab technicians were able to isolate and amplify these DNA traces. The profile developed from the scarf didn't match Jessica, confirming it had belonged to someone else. When cross-referenced with the partial samples from the cigarette butts found in her garden years ago, they showed a potential match, though the degraded quality of the older samples made absolute certainty impossible without more advanced analysis. Detective Martinez arranged for the DNA profile to be run through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, but no matches appeared in the database. Whoever had left their DNA on both the cigarettes and the scarf had never been arrested for a crime that would have placed their genetic profile in the system. The discovery of Jessica's vehicle and remains transformed the cold case into an active homicide investigation. The Boulder County Sheriff's Department established a dedicated task force, combining seasoned detectives with forensic specialists. They began the painstaking process of reviewing the entire case file through the lens of this new evidence, reaching out to original witnesses and revisiting locations connected to Jessica's final night. Meanwhile, the autopsy results provided another critical piece of information. Though limited by the condition of the remains, the medical examiner identified fracturing on the hyoid bone, a small horseshoe-shaped bone in the throat that often breaks during strangulation. This finding suggested Jessica had been manually strangled before being placed in the vehicle and driven to Marshall Lake. Jessica's family held a proper memorial service on May 15, 2019, nearly 22 years after she disappeared. Hundreds of community members attended, including many of the original search volunteers, investigators from 1997, and the current task force. The simple pine casket, adorned with local wildflowers Jessica had loved to paint, represented a bittersweet closure for a community that had never forgotten her. At the service, Detective Martinez quietly observed from the back, her mind still churning through the investigation. The DNA evidence remained their strongest lead, but without a match in any database, they needed another approach. After consulting with the FBI's investigative genealogy team, Martinez proposed a bold strategy: genetic genealogy, the same technique that had recently identified the Golden State Killer in California. The department leadership approved the plan, allocating special funding to this promising avenue. The DNA sample from the red scarf was sent to a specialized private lab that could perform the advanced sequencing needed for genetic genealogy analysis. Unlike traditional DNA matching, this technique would allow investigators to identify relatives of the suspect through commercial ancestry databases, then work backward to identify the killer through family connections. While waiting for these results, the task force continued pursuing conventional leads. They re-interviewed Thomas Weller, the climbing club acquaintance who had failed his polygraph in 1997. Now in his late 50s, Weller appeared genuinely shocked by the discovery of Jessica's remains. He voluntarily provided a DNA sample, which ultimately excluded him as the source of the DNA on the scarf and cigarettes. The team also revisited the reports of a strange customer at Jessica's flower shop. The original witness, now retired, still remembered the man's unsettling presence. With the help of a forensic artist, they developed an age-progressed sketch of this person of interest, distributing it throughout Boulder County and to neighboring jurisdictions. In July 2019, 3 months after the vehicle's discovery, the genetic genealogy results arrived. The DNA from the scarf had been successfully matched to several distant relatives in public genealogy databases. These connections weren't close, mostly third and fourth cousins, but provided enough genetic links for specialists to begin building family trees. genetic genealogists worked backward through marriage and birth records, obituaries, and public documents, constructing an intricate web of relationships. They focused on male descendants who would have been in their 20s or 30s in 1997 and had connections to the Boulder area. After weeks of meticulous analysis, they narrowed their focus to 3 family branches, containing 17 men who fit the basic profile. Through further research, investigators eliminated 12 candidates who had solid alibis for August 1997, some had been overseas, others incarcerated, and several had lived thousands of miles from Colorado. The remaining 5 men became the task force's primary focus. Detective Martinez and her team began discreetly investigating each man, building background profiles while being careful not to alert them to the investigation. They checked driver's license records, employment histories, criminal backgrounds, and social media footprints. One by one, candidates were eliminated through circumstantial evidence or voluntary DNA samples collected through various means, discarded coffee cups, cigarette butts, or direct requests for elimination samples. By September 2019, only one name remained on their list, Eric Donovan, age 48, who had worked as a landscaper in Boulder County from 1995 to 1998 before relocating to Arizona. Records showed he had performed seasonal maintenance for several businesses near Jessica's flower shop in the months before her disappearance. More disturbing, he had been questioned in a 2003 stalking case in Phoenix, though charges were ultimately dropped when the victim moved out of state. Martinez traveled to Phoenix to conduct surveillance on Donovan, now working as a maintenance supervisor for an apartment complex. For 3 days, she observed his routines, noting his solitary lifestyle and the precision with which he moved through his day. When Donovan discarded a water bottle at a gas station, Martinez seized the opportunity, retrieving it from the trash for DNA testing. The wait for results felt interminable. The entire task force held their breath as the lab rushed the analysis. When Martinez's phone rang on October 3, 2019, the lab director didn't waste time with preliminaries. "It's a match," he said simply. "The DNA from the water bottle is consistent with both the scarf and the cigarette butts from 1997. Statistical probability exceeds 99.9%. With this confirmation, the team secured an arrest warrant. Rather than risk alerting Donovan by requesting extradition, they coordinated with Phoenix police to make the arrest immediately. On October 5, as Donovan returned home from work, he found himself surrounded by tactical officers, weapons drawn. "Eric Donovan," announced the lead officer, "you're under arrest for the murder of Jessica Lynn Harmon." Donovan's face registered shock, then something like resignation. He surrendered without resistance, muttering only, "I always figured someday someone would come." News of the arrest exploded across Colorado. For Boulder residents who had lived with this unsolved tragedy for over 2 decades, the development was stunning. People who had been children when Jessica disappeared, now with families of their own, found themselves explaining to their children how a mystery from another era had suddenly roared back to life. Donovan was extradited to Colorado and formally charged with first-degree murder. The prosecution team, led by District Attorney Rebecca Sandoval, built their case meticulously. The DNA evidence formed the cornerstone, but they also presented the timeline of Donovan's landscaping work near Jessica's shop, his abrupt departure from Colorado shortly after her disappearance, and the similar stalking allegations from Arizona. Investigators dug deeper into Donovan's past, uncovering a pattern of obsessive behavior toward women. Former co-workers from his landscaping days recalled his unusual interest in female clients, particularly those who lived alone. One remembered Donovan collecting discarded receipts from Jessica's flower shop trash, behavior the co-worker had found odd but not alarming enough to report. Perhaps most damning was evidence recovered from Donovan's Phoenix apartment. In a locked storage unit in his complex's basement, detectives discovered a box containing newspaper clippings about Jessica's disappearance, a map of Boulder County with Marshall Lake circled, and a turquoise earring that matched the description of ones Jessica had been wearing when she vanished. As the prosecution built their case, detectives worked to reconstruct exactly what had happened on August 12, 1997. Through Donovan's work records and witness statements, they determined he had likely been watching Jessica's shop for weeks, learning her routines. On the night of her disappearance, he had followed her home, possibly entering her property while she stopped for gas. The cut phone line and removed window screen suggested he had disabled her communication and prepared an entry point before she arrived. When Jessica entered her home, he likely confronted her, resulting in a struggle that ended with strangulation. He then placed her body in her own vehicle, drove to a remote area to dispose of her purse and bracelet as a misdirection, and finally submerged the vehicle in Marshall Lake's deepest section. In February 2020, as the case prepared for trial, Donovan's attorney approached the district attorney with an unexpected proposal. His client was willing to plead guilty in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. After consultation with Jessica's family, who expressed a desire for closure rather than a protracted trial, the prosecution agreed. On February 28, 2020, Eric Donovan stood before Judge Michael Hernandez in a packed Boulder courtroom. When asked for his plea, he responded in a flat, emotionless voice, "Guilty." As part of the plea agreement, Donovan was required to provide a full confession. In clinical, detached language, he described how he had become fixated on Jessica after doing landscaping work near her shop. He admitted to watching her for weeks, entering her property multiple times when she wasn't home, and finally lying in wait on the night of August 12. "I cut the phone line and took out the window screen while she was at work," he stated. "When she came home, I confronted her. I just wanted to talk, but she tried to run. I grabbed her, and then..." He paused, showing the first emotion since his arrest. "I couldn't stop squeezing. When I realized what I'd done, I panicked. I put her in her Jeep, drove around for hours trying to figure out what to do, and eventually decided on the lake." Jessica's brother, permitted to address Donovan directly, delivered a powerful victim impact statement. "For 22 years, we lived in limbo, neither able to find justice nor properly mourn," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident on his face. "You didn't just take Jessica's life, you stole decades of closure from our family and this community. Nothing can undo that harm, but today, at least, the truth is finally known." Judge Hernandez sentenced Donovan to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. As he was led from the courtroom, the community that had carried Jessica's memory for so long collectively exhaled. The mystery that had haunted Boulder since 1997 was finally resolved. In the aftermath of the sentencing, Detective Martinez met privately with Jessica's family. They thanked her for her persistence, for believing their sister's case could be solved even after 2 decades. Martinez, typically stoic, found herself emotionally affected by this case unlike any other in her career. "Some cases just stay with you," she later told a colleague. "Even though I never knew Jessica, I felt like I did after spending so much time with her story. Everyone deserves justice, no matter how long it takes." The Boulder community held a candlelight vigil in the small park next to where Wild Roots Flower Shop had once stood. Now a local cafe, the owner had maintained a small memorial plaque for Jessica in the window all these years. Hundreds gathered, including many of the original search volunteers, now gray-haired but still carrying the memory of that frightening time when their mountain paradise first revealed its vulnerability. For the newer residents, the resolution of this cold case offered a window into their community's history and resilience. Parents who had increased their vigilance after hearing of Jessica's discovered remains now felt a measure of relief, though many acknowledged that the case had permanently altered their sense of security. The technology that ultimately solved Jessica's murder sparked considerable discussion among law enforcement professionals nationwide. The combination of preserved DNA evidence, advances in genetic genealogy, and dedicated cold case investigation demonstrated that the passage of time no longer guaranteed immunity for perpetrators. In the months following Donovan's sentencing, Boulder County saw an increase in tips related to other unsolved cases, as if the community had been reminded that answers might still be possible, even for decades-old mysteries. The Sheriff's Department, recognizing this momentum, allocated additional resources to their cold case unit. The Boulder Daily Camera ran a special feature on the anniversary of Jessica's disappearance in August 2020, interviewing key figures from the original investigation alongside Detective Martinez and the genetic genealogy team. The article highlighted how the persistence of Jessica's family, the preservation of evidence by forward-thinking investigators in 1997, and modern scientific advances had combined to achieve justice. Jessica's brother used funds from the Memorial Foundation to establish a permanent scholarship for forensic science students at the University of Colorado, ensuring his sister's legacy would contribute to solving other cases and bringing closure to other families. Marshall Lake, fully restored and refilled by spring 2021, no longer held its dark secret. Visitors to the peaceful reservoir were largely unaware of its role in the case, though some locals still regarded it with a certain solemnity. The Water Conservation District installed a small, unobtrusive bench near the shore with a simple plaque reading in memory of Jessica Lynn Harmon, whose truth rose from these waters. For Boulder, the resolution of Jessica's case represented more than justice for a single victim. It symbolized the community's unwavering commitment to remembering and honoring one of their own, no matter how much time passed. The cold case that had once exemplified the limits of 1990s investigative techniques now stood as testimony to the power of persistence, scientific advancement, and a community that refused to forget. The ripple effects of Jessica Harmon's solved case extended far beyond Boulder County. By mid-2021, her story had been featured in multiple true crime documentaries and podcasts, becoming a textbook example of how modern forensic techniques could breathe new life into decades-old cold cases. Law enforcement agencies nationwide began reviewing their own unsolved cases with fresh eyes, wondering what secrets might be unlocked with genetic genealogy. For Detective Elaine Martinez, the intense media attention proved both validating and exhausting. She gave carefully measured interviews, always redirecting praise toward the entire investigative team and technological advancements while emphasizing one simple truth: we never forgot Jessica. When you don't forget, you keep looking for answers. Behind the scenes, Martinez found herself struggling with unexpected emotions. She had invested so much of herself in bringing Jessica's killer to justice that the case's conclusion left a peculiar emptiness. During a mandatory department psychological evaluation, she reluctantly admitted feeling adrift. "I carried her with me for years," Martinez confessed to the department psychologist. "Now that it's over, I keep wondering if there are other victims out there, other families waiting for answers that might never come." This conversation proved pivotal in Martinez's career trajectory. With the support of her superiors, she began specialized training in cold case investigation and forensic genealogy techniques. By fall 2021, she was assigned to lead Boulder County's newly expanded cold case unit, with resources allocated specifically for applying advanced DNA analysis to unsolved murders and disappearances. Eric Donovan, meanwhile, began serving his life sentence at Colorado State Penitentiary in Cannon City. Prison records indicated he remained largely isolated, speaking little to other inmates or staff. During mandated psychiatric evaluations, he displayed classic signs of a sociopathic personality, a profound lack of remorse coupled with an intellectual understanding that his actions were considered wrong by society. When pressed about whether Jessica had been his only victim, Donovan maintained an ambiguous silence that troubled investigators. His work history showed he had moved between Colorado, Arizona, Nevada, and briefly Oregon between 1995 and 2019. Detectives in these states began reviewing unsolved cases from these periods, looking for similarities to Jessica's murder, single women targeted in their homes, evidence of stalking, missing vehicles. In February 2022, almost exactly 2 years after Donovan's sentencing, a potential breakthrough emerged. A detective in Flagstaff, Arizona flagged a 2001 missing persons case involving a 29-year-old botanist who had disappeared after working late at a university greenhouse. Her vehicle had never been recovered, but her apartment showed signs of a cut phone line and removed window screen, details that had never been publicly released in Jessica's case. Martinez flew to Arizona to coordinate with local investigators. They obtained permission to interview Donovan, though expectations were low given his previous reticence. In a sterile prison interview room, Martinez studied the man who had haunted her professional life. Donovan appeared thinner than at his sentencing, his once dark hair now streaked with gray, but his eyes remained unnervingly vacant. "I'm not here about Jessica," Martinez began, sliding a photograph across the table. "I'm here about Melissa Taylor." For the briefest moment, Donovan's impassive facade cracked, a flicker of recognition that Martinez, after countless interrogation hours, knew represented confirmation. Though he ultimately revealed nothing during that interview, his reaction provided enough justification for Arizona authorities to obtain a warrant for his DNA in connection with evidence from Melissa's case. The match, confirmed in April 2022, linked Donovan to a hair found in Melissa's apartment bathroom. With this new evidence, investigators intensified their review of unsolved cases across the Southwest. By summer 2022, they had identified 3 additional disappearances with striking similarities, though physical evidence was lacking in 2 cases. The implications were staggering. What had begun as the resolution of a single cold case in Boulder was potentially exposing a serial predator who had operated across multiple states for years. Law enforcement agencies that had once worked in isolation now coordinated efforts, sharing information and evidence through a dedicated task force headquartered in Denver. For the families of these other potential victims, Jessica's case represented both hope and anguish, hope that modern science might finally provide answers, but anguish that their loved ones' cases had remained unsolved while Donovan continued his predatory behavior for years. Melissa Taylor's parents, now in their 70s, traveled to Boulder to meet with Jessica's brother. Their shared grief created an immediate bond, and together they established a broader coalition of families affected by unsolved disappearances. They advocated for increased funding for cold case units and organized volunteer events to keep public attention focused on missing persons cases. The media narrative shifted from celebrating a single cold case triumph to examining the systemic failures that allowed a potential serial killer to operate undetected across state lines for decades. Journalists highlighted the lack of coordination between jurisdictions, insufficient resources for cold case investigations, and the historical limitations of DNA technology before recent advancements. A particularly poignant segment on a national news program featured Jessica's and Melissa's photographs side by side, emphasizing their similar features. Both had been athletic women with auburn hair and passionate interests in plants and the natural world. The segment raised uncomfortable questions about whether law enforcement might have connected these cases sooner had they recognized the pattern. In response to growing public pressure, the FBI formally joined the investigation in fall 2022, bringing additional resources and coordination capabilities. They launched a dedicated task force codenamed Operation Watershed, acknowledging how the draining of Marshall Lake had broken the case wide open. In Boulder, life gradually returned to a new normal. The memorial bench at Marshall Lake became a quiet place of reflection, occasionally visited by those who remembered Jessica or had followed her case. Local schools incorporated lessons about the investigation into forensic science curriculum, teaching students about how persistence and technological advancement had finally brought justice. Jessica's former cottage, which had stood vacant for years after her disappearance, was purchased by a young environmental scientist who, upon learning its history, decided to honor its former owner rather than erase the past. She created a butterfly garden in the backyard, planted with native species Jessica had documented in her sketchbooks. On the anniversary of Jessica's disappearance in 2022, she opened the garden to the community, creating a living memorial that celebrated Jessica's love of Colorado's natural beauty. By early 2023, the coordinated investigation had gathered substantial evidence linking Donovan to at least 2 additional disappearances beyond Jessica and Melissa. Prosecutors in Nevada prepared charges related to the 2004 disappearance of a 31-year-old casino employee whose case shared many hallmarks with Jessica's. Though her remains had never been found, advances in touch DNA had identified Donovan's genetic material on a personal item recovered from her apartment. The investigation also uncovered disturbing insights into how Donovan had selected and stalked his victims. Employment records revealed he had deliberately sought jobs that provided access to women's homes and workplaces, landscaping, maintenance, security installation. He maintained meticulous journals documenting women's routines, preferences, and vulnerabilities, often spending months observing potential victims before making contact. These revelations sent chills through communities where Donovan had lived and worked. Women who had encountered him professionally came forward with stories of uncomfortable interactions they had dismissed at the time: excessive attention, seemingly accidental meetings outside work, questions that in retrospect seemed designed to assess whether they lived alone. One former coworker from his time in Boulder recalled, "He could be charming when he wanted to be, but there was always something off about him." He'd remember details about clients that seemed overly personal. "We joked he had a photographic memory, but now I realize he was studying them like prey." For Detective Martinez, each new connection brought mixed emotions: vindication that her instincts about Donovan had been correct, but grief knowing earlier intervention might have saved lives. She channeled these feelings into developing a comprehensive profile of Donovan's methodology, which she presented at a national law enforcement conference in March 2023. "These weren't crimes of opportunity," she explained to a packed auditorium. "They were meticulously planned stalking operations that sometimes lasted months. He selected women who lived alone, often with professional interests in plants or nature, and he used legitimate employment to gain proximity and gather intelligence." The profile helped other agencies identify additional cases potentially connected to Donovan, including several where women had reported stalking but no physical attack had occurred, possible instances where his planning had been interrupted or abandoned. This broader understanding of his behavior pattern allowed investigators to build a comprehensive timeline of his movements and activities spanning more than 2 decades. In May 2023, the FBI announced a major breakthrough. Using ground-penetrating radar technology, they had identified a suspicious site near a reservoir outside Las Vegas where Donovan had worked briefly in 2004. The subsequent excavation revealed human remains later identified as Catherine Winters, the missing casino employee whose case had already been linked to Donovan through touch DNA. The discovery validated the theory that Donovan had established a pattern of submerging his victims in bodies of water, likely believing the evidence would be permanently destroyed. It also provided crucial physical evidence for the Nevada prosecution, transforming their case from circumstantial to concrete. As news of this discovery spread, Jessica's brother found himself reflecting on the complex journey toward justice. In a deeply personal essay published in the Boulder Daily Camera, he wrote, "For 22 years, I imagined Jessica was somewhere in the mountains she loved, perhaps in a peaceful ravine or beneath a stand of aspen trees." Learning she had spent those decades in the cold darkness of Marshall Lake was initially devastating. "But I've come to see that water is the vessel that preserved the truth until science and dedication could bring it to light. Water doesn't forget." And neither did the people who carried Jessica's memory all these years. The essay resonated deeply within the community and beyond, capturing the bittersweet nature of cold case resolutions. It was reprinted in newspapers across the country and became required reading in criminology courses examining the human impact of unsolved cases on families and communities. By summer 2023, prosecutors from Colorado, Arizona, and Nevada were coordinating their approach to the multiple cases against Donovan. Though he was already serving a life sentence without parole for Jessica's murder, they believed the additional victims deserved formal justice. They also recognized the potential for Donovan to use information about other victims as leverage unless all cases were properly adjudicated. In a strategic decision, they agreed to pursue the Arizona and Nevada cases sequentially, beginning with Melissa Taylor's murder in Flagstaff. The evidence there was strongest after Jessica's case, and Melissa's parents, both in declining health, deserved to see resolution while they were still able to attend proceedings. The Arizona trial began in September 2023. Unlike his plea in Jessica's case, Donovan pleaded not guilty, forcing prosecutors to present their full case. Over 3 grueling weeks, they methodically outlined the evidence connecting him to Melissa's disappearance: DNA from her apartment, his employment at a garden center near her university, cell phone records placing him in the vicinity on the night she vanished, and the distinctive signature elements of cut phone lines and removed window screens. The jury deliberated for just 7 hours before returning a guilty verdict. At the sentencing hearing in October 2023, Melissa's father, now using a wheelchair and oxygen, addressed the court. "For 22 years, we've lived with an open wound," he said, his voice thin but determined. My wife and I had accepted that we might go to our graves never knowing what happened to our daughter. Thanks to the dedicated work of investigators across state lines and the incredible advances in forensic science, we can now at least close this chapter. Melissa, like Jessica Harmon and the other victims, can finally rest in peace knowing her killer has been brought to justice. The judge sentenced Donovan to a second life term without parole, to be served consecutively with his Colorado sentence, largely a symbolic gesture given the impossibility of serving multiple life sentences, but one that acknowledged the distinct and terrible nature of each crime. The Nevada prosecution followed in early 2024, bolstered by the physical evidence recovered from the reservoir site. Again, Donovan was convicted and sentenced to life without parole. With each conviction, the picture of his decades-long predatory behavior became clearer and more horrifying. Throughout these proceedings, Detective Martinez remained a constant presence, attending each trial and serving as a liaison between the various jurisdictions. Her expertise in the Donovan cases made her an invaluable resource, and her commitment to the victims' families earned her their deep respect. In March 2024, the FBI formally concluded Operation Watershed after exhaustively investigating every unsolved case that potentially matched Donovan's methodology. Their final report linked him conclusively to 4 murders: Jessica Harmon, Melissa Taylor, Catherine Winters, and a previously unknown victim identified through remains found in Oregon. They also identified 6 additional disappearances where circumstantial evidence suggested his involvement but couldn't be proven conclusively. The report became the foundation for significant changes in how law enforcement agencies handled cold cases and cross-jurisdictional investigations. The FBI established a new national database specifically designed to flag signature elements of unsolved crimes that might indicate serial offenders operating across state lines. They also developed standardized protocols for preserving biological evidence in a manner that would maximize its potential for future analysis as technology advanced. For Boulder County, the ripple effects of Jessica's case transformed local law enforcement. The Sheriff's Department's cold case unit, once a part-time assignment for a single detective, expanded into a fully staffed division with specialized training in forensic genealogy and advanced DNA analysis. They implemented a systematic review of all unsolved homicides and disappearances dating back to the 1970s, prioritizing cases with preserved biological evidence. By spring 2024, this initiative had already identified promising leads in 3 previously stalled investigations. In a case bearing uncanny parallels to Jessica's, they used genetic genealogy to identify a suspect in a 1989 murder of a female park ranger. The man, now in his 70s and living in retirement in Florida, had never previously been connected to the crime. His arrest in April 2024 demonstrated again that the passage of time no longer guaranteed immunity for perpetrators. On August 12, 2024, the 27th anniversary of Jessica's disappearance, Boulder County unveiled a permanent memorial in the Central Park. Rather than a traditional somber monument, they created a vibrant native plant garden modeled after Jessica's own sketches and designs. The centerpiece featured a bronze sculpture of a woman with her arms outstretched, surrounded by the Colorado wildflowers Jessica had loved to document. The dedication ceremony brought together the many threads of Jessica's legacy: her family, friends who had kept her memory alive, investigators from the original case and the cold case team, and representatives from the forensic labs whose work had ultimately broken the case. Also present were family members of Donovan's other victims, bound together in a community forged through shared tragedy and eventual justice. Detective Martinez, recently promoted to lead the expanded cold case unit, delivered a brief but powerful address. "Today, we honor not just Jessica's memory, but the power of persistence," she said. "This garden will grow and change with the seasons, just as our ability to find truth evolves with time and technology. For the families still waiting for answers, know that we have not forgotten your loved ones. Justice may be delayed, but we are more determined than ever to ensure it is not denied." Jessica's brother, the final speaker, reflected on the long journey from tragedy to resolution. "For too many years, Jessica was defined by her disappearance, by the mystery of what happened that August night in 1997, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. Today, we reclaim her story. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, an artist, a nature lover. This garden reflects the beauty she created and appreciated every day of her life. Yes, her case changed how we investigate crimes and brought overdue justice for other victims. But today, we simply remember Jessica as she lived, not just how she died. As he finished speaking, dozens of painted lady butterflies were released into the garden, a symbolic representation of transformation and renewal. The crowd watched in reverent silence as the butterflies dispersed among the native flowers, their vibrant wings catching the summer sunlight. In the years that followed, Jessica's case would be studied in criminology programs nationwide, held up as an example of how persistence, scientific advancement, and cross-jurisdictional cooperation could solve even the coldest of cases. Law enforcement agencies implemented many of the lessons learned, resulting in a steady increase in the resolution rate for long-dormant investigations. For the Boulder community, the garden became a place of both remembrance and education. School groups toured the site, learning about native plants as well as the remarkable scientific advancements that had brought closure to Jessica's case. The garden's educational plaques explained in accessible language how DNA preservation, genetic genealogy, and dedicated investigation had combined to solve a mystery that once seemed impenetrable. Visitors from across the country came to see the memorial, often leaving small stones or pressed flowers at the base of the sculpture, a tradition that emerged organically and spoke to the way Jessica's story had touched people far beyond Colorado. Many were families of missing persons who found in Jessica's case a reason to maintain hope for resolution in their own situations. Perhaps most significantly, the Jessica Harmon Foundation, initially established to maintain her memory through scholarships, evolved into a powerful advocacy organization for cold case investigation. The foundation lobbied for legislation requiring standardized evidence preservation protocols and dedicated funding for cold case units. They also raised money to support smaller jurisdictions in utilizing genetic genealogy and advanced DNA analysis for unsolved homicides. By 2025, the foundation had helped secure funding for the analysis of biological evidence in over 50 cold cases nationwide, resulting in 11 identifications and 7 convictions. Each success reinforced the message at the heart of Jessica's case, that no matter how much time had passed, the truth could still come to light. Detective Martinez, reflecting on the transformation that had occurred since that day in 2019 when a maintenance worker spotted something metallic gleaming in the receding waters of Marshall Lake, often returned to a simple metaphor. Cold cases are like seeds buried in frozen ground, she would explain to new detectives joining her unit. They appear dormant, but they contain all the information needed for the truth to eventually grow and blossom. Our job is to provide the right conditions, persistence, scientific advancement, and an absolute refusal to forget, so that justice, no matter how delayed, can finally emerge into the light. In Boulder, as summer moved into fall and the native plants in Jessica's memorial garden shifted from vibrant blooms to the warm colors of autumn, visitors continued to come. They touched the bronze sculpture, read about the case that had changed investigative practices nationwide, and reflected on how a tragedy from nearly 3 decades earlier had transformed into a legacy of justice, science, and remembrance. Jessica Lynn Harmon, once defined by her disappearance, was now remembered for all that her case had made possible: the cold cases solved, the families given closure, the advances in forensic science implemented, and perhaps most importantly, the message her story carried forward, that truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of rising to the surface when those who seek it refuse to give up. Beyond the memorial garden and the cold cases solved through Jessica's legacy, 2025 brought a more profound shift in how society viewed unsolved mysteries and the enduring commitment to seek truth. The story of Jessica Harmon and Eric Donovan evolved from a local Colorado tragedy into a catalyst for national reform in the handling of cold cases. In January 2025, the U.S. Department of Justice announced the establishment of the National Cold Case Initiative, a program directly inspired by the success of Jessica's investigation. The initiative provided federal resources, advanced forensic technology, and specialized training to local agencies struggling with unsolved homicides and disappearances. The program's logo featured a subtle water ripple design, an acknowledgement of how Jessica's remains, discovered in Marshall Lake, had created waves of change throughout the criminal justice system. Within 6 months, the initiative had already facilitated the resolution of 17 long-dormant cases nationwide. Each success reinforced the powerful message that technological advancement, combined with dedicated investigation, could overcome the obstacles of time and limited evidence. For Detective Elaine Martinez, who had been instrumental in breaking Jessica's case, this period brought personal reflection alongside professional recognition. Now supervising a team of 8 specialized cold case investigators, she found herself increasingly drawn to the educational aspects of her work. She began developing a training curriculum for law enforcement agencies, focusing on evidence preservation methods that would maximize future analysis opportunities as technology continued to evolve. The greatest tragedy in cold case investigation, Martinez often told her students, isn't just the original crime, but the lost opportunities when evidence isn't properly preserved for future technologies we can't yet imagine. Her approach emphasized thinking generations ahead, protecting biological samples from contamination and degradation even when current testing methods couldn't fully analyze them. This forward-thinking methodology, which she called evidence stewardship, quickly gained traction in forensic circles nationwide. In Boulder County, the expanded cold case unit continued building on Jessica's momentum. By mid-2025, they had revisited every unsolved homicide in their jurisdiction dating back to 1975, prioritizing cases with preserved biological evidence. This systematic review led to the resolution of 5 additional cases, including a 1983 murder that had haunted the community for more than 4 decades. The victim, a 28-year-old elementary school teacher named Diane Keller, had been found strangled in her home with few leads beyond unidentified fingerprints that didn't match any in databases at the time. Using advanced fingerprint enhancement techniques and artificial intelligence pattern recognition unavailable when the crime occurred, investigators identified a match to a former maintenance worker who had died in 1997. Though the perpetrator couldn't be brought to justice, providing answers to Diane's aging parents gave them peace in their final years. "I never thought I'd know who took my daughter before I died," Diane's mother told reporters, her voice wavering with emotion. Jessica Harmon's case opened the door for all of us still waiting for answers. These detectives never gave up, even when our case was older than they were. This theme of intergenerational justice, younger detectives solving crimes that occurred before their birth, became increasingly common as cold case units expanded nationwide. For many young investigators, including those who had joined Boulder County's team, Jessica's case represented the gold standard of persistence and methodology. One such detective, Marcus Washington, had been a criminal justice student at the University of Colorado when Jessica's remains were discovered in Marshall Lake. The case had so profoundly influenced his career path that he specifically applied to join Boulder's cold case unit after graduation. In 2025, his dedication led to the resolution of a 1992 disappearance of a hiker in the foothills west of Boulder. Using drone technology with ground-penetrating radar, equipment that hadn't existed when Jessica vanished, Washington's team identified anomalies in a remote ravine. The subsequent excavation recovered remains later confirmed to be the missing hiker, along with evidence linking the death to a convicted murderer already serving a life sentence in Wyoming for an unrelated crime. Jessica's case taught us to think beyond conventional search methods, Washington explained during a presentation at a forensic conference in Denver. We now approach cold cases with the mentality that if traditional techniques didn't find answers, we need to apply technologies and perspectives that weren't available to our predecessors. This willingness to embrace new methodologies extended beyond law enforcement to academic institutions. In September 2025, the University of Colorado inaugurated the Center for Cold Case Research and Innovation, a multidisciplinary collaboration between the forensic science, computer science, and genetic engineering departments. The center's mission was to develop next-generation tools specifically designed for analyzing degraded evidence from long unsolved cases. Jessica's brother, who had become a respected advocate for cold case investigation reform, was invited to deliver the keynote address at the center's opening ceremony. Standing before an audience of scientists, law enforcement professionals, and families of missing persons, he spoke about the transformative power of persistence. For 22 years, the evidence that would eventually identify my sister's killer lay silent in the mud of Marshall Lake, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his expression. During those decades, the science that would eventually speak for Jessica was gradually developing in laboratories around the world. Today, we accelerate that process by intentionally bringing together the brightest minds across multiple disciplines, united in the common purpose of giving voice to victims who can no longer speak for themselves. The center quickly established itself as a pioneer in developing specialized techniques for cold case evidence. Their first major breakthrough came in December 2025 with the creation of an advanced DNA extraction method capable of recovering viable samples from materials previously considered too degraded for analysis. The technique, which they named Harmon sequencing in Jessica's honor, used a combination of enzymatic amplification and artificial intelligence pattern recognition to reconstruct fragmented genetic material. When the research team demonstrated the method by successfully extracting a complete DNA profile from a 35-year-old bloodstain that had been repeatedly exposed to environmental contamination, the implications for cold case investigation were immediately apparent. Cases previously considered unsolvable due to degraded evidence suddenly held new promise. The first application of Harmon sequencing to an actual cold case came in February 2026, when the technique was used to analyze a partial fingerprint from a 1977 double homicide in rural Colorado. The enhanced genetic material yielded a familial DNA match that eventually led investigators to a 76-year-old man living under an assumed name in New Mexico. The arrest, nearly 5 decades after the crimes, demonstrated once again that the passage of time no longer guaranteed immunity for perpetrators. For the families of victims, these advances in forensic technology represented a new kind of hope, not the anxious, day-to-day hope of a fresh investigation, but a steady confidence that science would eventually unlock the truth, even if it took decades. This sentiment was powerfully expressed at the annual gathering at Jessica's Memorial Garden in August 2026. What had begun as a solemn remembrance had evolved into something more forward-looking, a celebration of resilience and scientific progress. The event now drew families from across the country who had experienced similar losses, creating a community united by shared experience and newfound optimism. One attendee, whose daughter had disappeared in 1999 and whose case remained unsolved, described the comfort he found in witnessing Jessica's legacy. "For years, I was told that the chances of finding answers diminished with each passing day," he explained, gently touching a butterfly that had landed on the memorial sculpture. "Now I understand that in some ways, time is on our side. Every day brings new scientific advances, new techniques, new possibilities." Jessica's case proved that patience and persistence eventually yield truth. This perspective, that time could be an ally rather than an enemy in the search for justice, represented a profound shift in how both law enforcement and families approached cold cases. Rather than viewing these investigations as increasingly hopeless with the passage of years, they were now seen as opportunities awaiting the right technological breakthrough. Eric Donovan, meanwhile, continued serving his multiple life sentences in solitary confinement. Prison records indicated he remained largely unresponsive to rehabilitation efforts, maintaining his emotional detachment and speaking only when necessary. However, in early 2026, a development occurred that surprised even the most seasoned investigators. Through his court-appointed attorney, Donovan expressed willingness to provide information about additional crimes in exchange for certain privileges, not reduced sentences, as he knew that was impossible, but small comforts like additional books and occasional access to outdoor recreation. After careful consideration and consultation with the victims' families, prosecutors from Colorado, Arizona, and Nevada agreed to a limited arrangement. Donovan would be interviewed by a joint task force, with any information strictly verified before privileges were granted. The interviews, conducted over several weeks in a secure prison facility, revealed the full extent of Donovan's predatory behavior. He confessed to 2 additional murders, a 1999 case in Oregon and a 2007 case in Washington state, providing details that only the perpetrator could know. He also described several instances where he had stalked women but abandoned his plans due to unexpected complications or stronger security measures than anticipated. Perhaps most disturbing were his detailed explanations of how he selected victims and established surveillance. He described methodically searching for women who lived alone, particularly those with predictable routines and interests in natural sciences or outdoor activities. This profile, he explained dispassionately, aligned with his ability to use landscaping and maintenance work as cover for observation. The task force carefully documented every detail, cross-referencing his statements with unsolved cases and verifying claims before sharing information with relevant jurisdictions. For the families of the additional victims he identified, the revelations brought the painful closure they had sought for years. The interviews also yielded valuable insights into predatory psychology that were subsequently incorporated into law enforcement training nationwide. Detectives learned to recognize the warning signs of stalking behavior and to better understand how. Nationwide. In December 2026, she was invited to deliver the commencement address at the FBI Academy's specialized cold case investigation course. Standing before a new generation of investigators, she reflected on the lessons of Jessica's case. 29 years ago, Jessica Harmon disappeared, and for 22 of those years, her case sat in the cold files, waiting for science to catch up to the evidence, Martinez told the gathered graduates. What I want you to remember is that every cold case in your jurisdiction represents both a tragedy and an opportunity, a tragedy for the victims and their families, but an opportunity for dedicated investigators armed with advancing technology to finally uncover the truth. She paused, looking out at the faces of those who would carry this work forward long after her retirement. The most important quality in cold case investigation isn't scientific knowledge or technical skill, though those are certainly valuable, she continued. It's persistence, the absolute refusal to let a case be forgotten simply because time has passed. When you return to your jurisdictions, I urge you to look at your cold files not as cases that failed, but as cases that are still waiting for the right combination of dedication and scientific advancement to be resolved. As Martinez concluded her address, a powerful thunderstorm that had been building throughout the ceremony finally broke. Rain poured down on the Academy's roof, creating a rumbling backdrop to her final words. Water reveals what time conceals, she said, unconsciously echoing the metaphor that had defined her career since Jessica's discovery. Every drop of rain that falls today carries molecules that have existed since the beginning of time. They have witnessed everything, forgotten nothing. Our job is to learn how to read the stories they have to tell. Back in Boulder, Jessica's memorial garden had matured into a vibrant ecosystem. Native plants flourished, attracting butterflies and hummingbirds throughout the growing season. The bronze sculpture at its center had developed the soft green patina of age, giving it an organic quality that seemed to emerge from the landscape rather than being placed upon it. Visitors still came regularly, families of missing persons seeking hope, law enforcement professionals paying respect to a case that had changed their field, and local residents who simply appreciated the peaceful beauty of the space. Many left small tokens, polished stones, pressed flowers, or handwritten notes of gratitude. On a quiet morning in late December 2026, as the garden lay dormant under a light dusting of snow, Jessica's brother made an unannounced visit. Nearly 30 years had passed since his sister's disappearance, and he had devoted much of his life to ensuring her case created lasting change. Now in his 60s, he had recently stepped back from his role with the foundation, passing leadership to a younger generation of advocates. He brushed snow from the bench facing the sculpture and sat in contemplative silence. After a long moment, he spoke quietly, his words visible in the cold air. "We did it, Jess," he said simply. "Your case changed everything." A chickadee landed on the sculpture's outstretched hand, regarding him curiously before flitting away to a nearby pine. He smiled at the small interaction, seeing in it a reflection of his sister's love for Colorado's wildlife. Rising from the bench, he placed a small stone at the sculpture's base, a piece of rose quartz Jessica had collected on one of their hikes decades earlier. He had carried it with him since her disappearance, a tangible connection to his lost sister. Now, it seemed right to leave it here, in this place where her memory had transformed from a story of tragedy into one of justice and hope. As he turned to leave, he noticed a young woman entering the garden, her expression suggesting she was visiting for the first time. Their eyes met briefly, and he nodded in greeting before continuing on his way. He didn't need to stay and tell Jessica's story anymore. The garden, the foundation, the cold case initiatives, and the scientific advancements named in her honor would continue speaking for her long after he was gone. The young woman approached the sculpture, reading the plaque that summarized Jessica's case and the changes it had inspired. She placed her hand gently on the bronze arm, connecting physically with the memorial as so many had done before her. Unknown to Jessica's brother, this visitor had her own connection to the case. She was a first-year detective who had recently joined Boulder's cold case unit, inspired by the legacy of persistence and innovation Jessica's investigation had established. She had come to the garden seeking inspiration for a particularly challenging case that had just been assigned to her, a 1971 disappearance with minimal preserved evidence. Standing before the sculpture, she found herself making a silent promise to approach this cold case with the same dedication that had eventually brought Jessica justice. The technological advances of the past decade had opened new possibilities for even the oldest unsolved cases, and she was determined to apply every available resource to her investigation. As snow began falling again, softly blanketing the dormant garden, the detective remained a moment longer, contemplating the journey from tragedy to transformation that had begun with a woman who disappeared one August night in 1997 and concluded with a movement that had changed criminal investigation forever. Jessica Lynn Harmon's story had evolved from a local mystery to a national legacy, a testament to the enduring power of truth to rise, even after decades submerged in darkness. For the countless families still waiting for answers, her case stood as both comfort and promise, a reminder that no matter how much time passed, justice remained possible for those who refused to let the truth remain buried. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.